Hello and welcome to another edition of GNAT-TV's In-Depth series. I'm Andrew McKeever, the news director at GNAT-TV's News Project, and it's a pleasure to have you with us today on Friday, July 1st. We've been conducting a series of interviews with candidates who are running for statewide office, and today it's our pleasure to have with us Isaac Evans-Frantz, who's running in the Democratic Party's primary for the U.S. Senate. That's the seat that's currently held by Senator Patrick Leahy, who, as I'm sure all of you know, will be stepping down at the end of this year, finishing off a nearly 50-year career in the U.S. Senate. Congressman Peter Welch has announced that he would like to move up from the Congress to the Senate, and jumping into that primary to give Mr. Welch a little competition is Mr. Evans-Frantz, who we're really delighted to have with us today to hear from him about his views on the issues and why voters should consider him when it comes time to cast your ballot, either in the primary on August 9th or through early voting, which is already underway. Mr. Evans-Frantz, welcome to the News Project.
Thank you. It's good to be here with you.
Well, thank you again for making the time for our conversation today. And I guess I thought we could start by simply having you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what prompted you to run this year.
Sure. Well, I grew up here in Brattleboro in a low-income rural family. Growing up, my neighbors always were super important. We helped each other out when we were in trouble, and that's the kind of spirit that has inspired me to do the activism that I've done. When I was a high school student at Brattleboro Union High School, I organized students around the state to campaign for student seats on the Vermont State Board of Education. And we won that campaign, and Governor Howard Dean appointed me as the first student with a vote on the board. After that, I worked in schools, I worked in community health centers, I was a union representative for my health center, and I also organized. I organized my coworkers for fair wages, for contract. I also organized for global solidarity. I organized with a group that became a national organization that my most recent job has been that I was the director of that. We had trained organizers in 20 states, and we campaigned for humanitarian issues, for human rights, for saving lives around the world. What I got to do in that role is build national coalitions with other organizations, like bringing together tens of organizations representing tens of millions of Americans for a global COVID response, where we secured the largest amount of global relief at an international level that has ever been released by a single body. We also organized the largest anti-war mobilization since 2003, when we held a global day of action, World Says No to War on Yemen. And I've been so happy to be able to work with Vermonters and people around this country for critical legislative change. Not just on the international work, but also here in Vermont, helping expand access to dental care and expanding our dental workforce. Really proud of the work that I was able to contribute to in getting legislation through the state legislature and signed by the governor a few years back.
Wow, well, that's quite an impressive resume. I guess I thought we could start by talking as well a little bit about some of the issues that you've outlined on your campaign's website,
Sure.
Sort of central to your candidacy. And one that you mentioned frequently is climate change and the climate crisis. You mentioned that you support a transition to 100% renewable energy by 2030 on the website.
Yes.
Was this divestment from fossil fuels and subsidizing safe renewable energy? I guess I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about how you think in the space of 8 years, we're going to be able to get from our present level of renewable energy to 100%. That seems like a very ambitious goal.
It is an ambitious goal, but it's a critical goal. It's one that we need to be able to rally around. We need to be mobilizing people in the streets. That's the thing, is that with our current Congress, we're not going to make that. We're not going to get there. Congress is not going to do that on their own. That's why we need people like the activists that I've worked with who mobilize people for the changes that we need. I've seen situations where DC insiders have said, you're never going to achieve that. That's basically impossible. And then we've organized around this country. We've shown up in front of congressional offices, and we got legislation through a divided Congress, a Republican-controlled Senate, a Democratically controlled House, and to the president's desk. So I know that things that feel impossible, we can actually achieve when people decide that this is a priority. I had the privilege of helping mobilize the largest climate demonstration in history when in 2014, when we marched in New York City for global climate action. And it was started with like 20 people in a room. And at the end, there were hundreds of thousands of people who were taking to the streets. I had the privilege of speaking with Senator Schumer, organizing a meeting with him to talk about climate action, the need for bold action. And unfortunately, that legislation a few years back did not pass. But I know that when Americans show up, when they show up in the streets, when they show up in front of congressional offices, we make our voices clear. And the majority of Americans want bold climate action. The majority of Americans don't want this climate crisis to be just worsening. We understand that there's a climate emergency, that this is a public health crisis. So it's a matter of political will, and it's a matter of organizing and inspiring and mobilizing. Because our biggest obstacle, I don't think, is the CO2 emissions. It's not the ice caps that are melting. I think it's our discouragement, our despair, and the way that we feel helpless. But everybody can contribute to the solution. Everybody can help out. And biking across the state, talking about climate action with communities in Barrie and Montpelier, Burlington, and towns along the way, I heard that this is something that resonates with Vermonters. People want action. They want solutions. And I'm hearing a lot of the candidates in the Democratic primary here talking about this.
Because it seems like in the short run, at least in the last year or two, given economic trends, the war in Ukraine, and a few other situations, it almost seems like that task has been made even more difficult by just sort of economic currents going on at the moment. It was always going to be, I think, in my view anyway, a difficult lift to kind of convert industries that currently rely heavily on fossil fuels to shift over to wind or solar or other renewables. And if anything, the events of the last few months have seemed to underscore how much harder that's going to be.
They've underscored how much harder it can be, but they've also underscored how important it is to have that energy independence, the renewable energy. With seeing what's been going on with Russia and Ukraine, now Biden is planning a trip to Saudi Arabia to talk with MBS, the Saudi dictator, and shake hands with him and basically begging to try to get cheaper prices at the pump. Now, that's not what the United States should be doing. This is a moment for getting off of oil, not going around trying to strengthen the alliance with another oil dictator. We need energy independence, and this is in the interest of national security. It's in the interest of the lowering prices. It's in the interest of the American people to have renewable energy. This is an opportunity, I see. Every crisis is an opportunity for us to change the way we're doing things. So it's hard, but it's possible.
Well, I want to touch on some of the foreign policy aspects, again, that you mentioned on your website. Some interesting points there. But before we leave the climate energy area, I guess I was wondering what your reaction was to the Supreme Court decision that was announced yesterday that would seem to limit the power of the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate coal-fired power stations and other utilities. I mean, the initial reaction seems to be that this is going to make reducing those carbon emissions even harder than it already was.
It's a tragedy. It's a tragedy that the Supreme Court is making it even harder to take the necessary steps in this climate emergency that we are facing. This is an existential crisis. That's partly why I'm running for U.S. Senate, because we need a leader who's going to stand up to the corporate interests, who's going to stand up for bold action, who's going to bring the voices of everyday Americans who want a future that's safe and livable for our children and our grandchildren, who are willing to bring those voices to the center, to bring those voices to Washington, to work with activists around this country to get the sorts of changes that we need. We have a path forward if we get rid of the filibuster. I'm glad to hear that the president has been speaking about that and supporting it. We can codify the laws that are needed so that we get the legislative change to have that safe future that we need. And it's not just about the future, it's about the now too, because there are people around the world who are suffering, whether it's wildfires in the West, whether it's flooding and hurricanes around the world, droughts in Africa. There is a need for climate action now, and there's also a need to support the people who are facing climate disasters, because this is a matter of justice. The people who have historically contributed the most to climate change are the ones who are actually suffering the least. It's the people who have contributed the least who are suffering the most. So we have a moral obligation, I believe, as the United States, to stand with people who are being hurt first and worst by this crisis.
Well, before we finish, I'm sure we'll get back to the Supreme Court again in a moment or two, but I did want to ask you a couple of questions about your approach to foreign policy that the United States should be pursuing. There's several interesting points you make there on your website. One that really caught my eye was the one paragraph that relates to the Ukrainian situation. You mentioned that you think we should repeal broad-based economic sanctions, widely considered acts of war. These do not usually achieve their stated goals, while they kill civilians and foster anti-American sentiment. Replace those with targeted, time-bound sanctions that include clear criteria for being lifted. And then you also add, we should work towards the immediate end of the war in Ukraine, prioritizing a diplomatic end to the conflict, and accept refugees displaced by the war. So are you suggesting that even if we were to, and all the parties involved were to say, okay, let's just sort of call a ceasefire as of today, with the Russian forces occupying, it looks like, a significant chunk of the eastern part of Ukraine, that's a price we should be willing to pay in order to achieve a ceasefire and perhaps an eventual end to the war there?
Andrew, could you say your question once more? I want to make sure I understand it.
Well, I'm just wondering if you think the status quo as of today in Ukraine, where the Russian forces are occupying a large chunk of eastern Ukraine, the Luhansk and Donbass region, is that a price that we should be willing to accept and perhaps encourage the Ukrainians to accept as a way to end the conflict today? When you say work towards the immediate end of the war in Ukraine, or should we be holding out to have a situation where the Russians retreat back to the borders of February 24th?
The fact is that right now civilians are paying the price for this war. And my priority in this situation, as has been my priority in the conflict in Yemen and other places around the world, is always civilians. So how do we protect civilian life, and how do we minimize the amount of harm? It's been devastating. It's been vast. But moving forward, there has to be an off-ramp. That we have to ask ourselves, how does this end? And I know that there are increasing calls for that from the New York Times editorial board, from within the State Department. We are in a different place than we were in February. We need to be making sure that we're looking towards what is the way that we rapidly end this war. Escalation with another nuclear power is not what the world needs right now. So we have very competent people in the State Department, people who are very smart, people who want peace, people who want to protect civilian life, and those are the voices that we need to be following and listening to. And I will say that we also need consistency and integrity in U.S. foreign policy. I so appreciate the way that Vermonters have been, and Americans in general, have been standing with the Ukrainian people. I'd like to see that same level of solidarity with the victims of US-backed war crimes in Yemen. I'd like to see an increasing energy in the United States to stop US complicity of the Saudi devastating war on Yemen. The United States has been supplying weapons and military support for 7 years. So proud of the work that we've done here in Vermont. It's been everyday Vermont residents who've been showing up in Burlington and in Brattleboro and across the state, rallying in front of our congressional offices, calling for action. And we're so glad that Bernie Sanders has agreed to introduce a companion bill in the US Senate And it was because of Vermonters organizing that we have gotten this far. We need consistency in U.S. foreign policy to make sure that we're not supporting any countries that are bombing their neighbors and causing vast suffering.
And a big looming issue, I think, for the U.S. in foreign affairs, and well, it's already been one for several years now, is what our stance should be towards China. Because there seems to be a connection between Ukraine and the potential that the Chinese might think, time to re-annex Taiwan, creating a major international crisis there potentially. But in general, what should our stance be towards China? I mean, this is a country that many people have described as an authoritarian state. We have a very complicated trade and economic relationship with them. Would you like to see any specific changes made in that economic relationship, for instance, tariffs, or how should we be approaching the Chinese, I guess, in general?
Our priority should be diplomacy and de-escalation. We, again, need to be prioritizing the needs of everyday people, of citizens, and that means that we're going to be striving for peace in the world, and it means that we look for avenues for de-escalation and diplomacy.
Okay, well, let's turn to a couple of other points that you mentioned as being critical and central to your candidacy. Housing and healthcare are two of them that you mentioned again on your website. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what your approaches would be towards creating more affordable workforce housing and what you would like to see happen on the healthcare front.
Housing and healthcare, I believe, are human rights. There's no reason that anybody in our state should be without a home or without healthcare, or that matter anywhere in our country or this world. In terms of housing, I support Senator Warren's bill, the American Housing and Economic Mobility Act, introduced last year, which Senator Sanders has co-sponsored along with a number of other senators. This legislation would make it easier for first-time homeowners to buy a home. That's an important piece of legislation. I also support increasing our housing stock. We need to build more housing to take the pressure off the market, because it's people across the class system, across the economic, socioeconomic status are feeling this pressure. I was just when I was on my bike trip across the state, stopping and talking with folks in Barrie. There was a restaurant owner he owns a restaurant, but they can't find a house that they can buy. Can you imagine that? You can own a restaurant, but you can't own a home? Something's off there. So this is a matter affecting so many Vermonters. So many people are telling me about that. And I'm hearing that over and over again. We need to create more housing. We need to make sure that for low-income folks, they have the support that they need, that we make sure that people have the vouchers, the Section 8 vouchers, that we're funding that program on the federal level, and also that we're providing supportive housing to people who need extra support, whether they're elderly, have disabilities, have mental health challenges. Housing is so key. And housing is healthcare. If people have housing, that can help provide stability, it helps our economy. It's so important for us. In terms of healthcare, having worked in community health centers for many years, I saw the importance of everybody being able to access healthcare. I support Medicare for all. I'd actually like to see improved Medicare. Both my parents have Medicare. No, they don't get dental care through Medicare. No, why don't we consider the mouth and our teeth part of the body just like we consider everything else? So we've done pretty well in terms of Medicare below the neck. We want to make sure that above the neck, we also are taking care of people. So that includes behavioral health, mental health, substance abuse treatment. We want to make sure that people can access all the services they need to live healthy, happy lives.
Just before we leave the housing question, I just was wondering, one of the things that has struck me as ironic a bit about fixing the housing shortage is that when a housing project is proposed in a town or on the outskirts of a town, it seems like I'm sure this doesn't happen all the time, but frequently enough, it seems like the neighbors nearby are a little bit uneasy about having a, let's say, 10 or 20 unit workforce housing project within eye range. How do you think we work around that to create the number of new homes that are needed, clearly, and yet don't seem to, get in the view shed, or whatever the right term is in planning lexicon, for folks who might say, yeah, I think it's great to have more housing, but just don't build it here.
Yeah, I've seen that too, even locally. And I've seen that particularly when it comes to low income housing or affordable housing, there can be real concerns about, oh, who is this going to attract? And you start seeing some of that not in my backyard syndrome come up. Part of this is a matter of education, so that we have, and community buy-in, community discussions, people can understand the importance. I think it's a matter of relationship building. So if people have those relationships, they feel comfortable with people coming in, but it's also just a matter of, people need housing, and we need to create more housing for people. One thing I've heard from Vermonters is this idea that in addition to expanding housing out, we can also expand up. So we don't have a lot of skyscrapers in Vermont, and I'm happy to keep it that way. But there's something in between just a one family unit and maybe adding a couple of units just above. So that's available space that we should be thinking about.
Okay. Turning back to some maybe more federal and Supreme Court related questions, the court has been very busy over the past couple of weeks, handing down a couple of decisions that have been, I guess, fair to say, controversial. And obviously, the one that stands out is the one on reproductive rights and abortion that in the Dobbs case that came out, I guess it was last week. What was your reaction to that? Do you feel that if you felt that was an incorrect decision that they arrived at, is the answer then federal legislation to make abortion or reproductive rights universally available across the country?
My reaction was to protest and to organize. The first thing that my team did is we sent an email out to all of our supporters across the state and gave them information about protests that were happening throughout. And then I went down to the protest in Brattleboro and connected with people. And the first thing that I did was I just provided support to people on my team who were in tears, because this is personal for a lot of people. People who have fought really hard to get these rights that we have and these sorts of individual liberties, these sorts of protections of civil rights, to see them stripped away is devastating. So the first thing for me is connecting with people on a human level and just acknowledging what this means to people and the emotional toll this takes. In terms of policy, we do need to be able to pass legislation. We need to codify Roe v. Wade, and that means that we need to get rid of the filibuster. We also need to, in the meantime, make sure that we are protecting the rights of people to travel. People are being held, there are attempts in states to hold people hostage so that if they have an unplanned pregnancy that they are chosen to terminate, that there are attempts to control them and keep them from leaving the state to be able to go to a state where they could terminate their pregnancy. I worked as a reproductive health educator in community health centers, where I was providing the vast majority of the pregnancy options counseling. I provided the pregnancy test results to patients who came in seeking pregnancy tests, and then I provided information about parenting, adoption, and abortion. Those were the three options that we talked about. I saw how important it is to people to have this information and have the options. I remember a woman who was devout Catholic. She came in and she was devastated by the news of the positive pregnancy test. And she shared with me about the shame that she felt. She had a medical condition that meant it was unsafe to continue with that pregnancy. I'm so glad that it was just a routine part of our conversation to talk about the options, so that she was able to have the support and have the comfort and have the knowledge and the resources that she needed just to follow through and do what she needed to do for her health. So I support expanding I support expanding laws that, like we have in Vermont, that allow abortion, and I'm glad to see that there's an effort here to make this part of our a constitutional protection with Proposal 5 in the November election. I will say one other thing, just personally, about how I responded, is that I'm aware how the threats to one group of people is also a threat to all of us. So, the same day the decision came down, we heard Clarence Thomas talking about how next on the chopping block was the access to contraception, was marriage equality. Today it may be my friend's body, tomorrow it could be my marriage. We need to stand up for one another.
We only have a few minutes left, and there's about 12 questions I'd love to ask. But one I guess I'm just intrigued by, you mentioned this a couple of times in the course of our conversation here, is eliminating the filibuster rule, which of course requires in the U.S. Senate 60 votes to get, it seems like, just about anything passed. How does that happen? I mean, the filibuster is not embedded in the Constitution. It was simply a doctrine that evolved over the course of the last 200 or whatever years. But it seems like there are a number of very passionate defenders of that in the U.S. Senate currently. And not ironically enough, I would imagine it would probably take 60 votes to overturn the filibuster, which we're not likely to have, at least in the current Senate. So how do we ditch the filibuster?
This is something where, again, I see the role for citizen engagement, for people like myself, everyday Americans, to show up in front of their congressional offices and to make them change and to make those senators take the right position on this. Because this is a matter of restoring confidence in our system, restoring confidence of Americans in our government. If we can't have majority rule within our government, how are people going to feel inspired to go out and vote? So many times I hear people say, they're all the same, all the politicians. Why does it matter? That's what my campaign is about, to show, no, it does matter. Every person counts. Every voice is important. And we're about bringing those voices to the table.
So one last question, and I'm going to have to ask you to, really probably condense your answer way shorter and tighter than you probably would like to. But
okay.
I think it's an important one, and one I've kind of been intrigued with, and that's your call to cancel the $1.3 trillion in federally owned student debt. That's been discussed a bit. There's, I guess, two sides to that. One is like, well, hey, people took this debt on willingly. There are a number of people that hold it that probably come from families that can afford to pay it, or they can afford to pay it. How do we just wipe it out? Is that the answer?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's short and succinct.
I support Senator Sanders' leadership on this. Vermonters have, for many years, supported Bernie, and from across the political spectrum, and I support Bernie on this.
Okay. Well, we're going to have to leave it there for today, Mr. Evans-Frantz. I really appreciate your time, and good luck out there on the campaign trail. And who knows, perhaps we'll have another chance to talk again and do those 12 other questions that we didn't get to today.
Thank you so much for your time, and thanks to everybody watching.
Okay, well, thank you. And thanks to all of you who have been watching, and I hope you found our program interesting. And, we'll see you again next time. We still have several more candidates to have conversations with, so not done yet. Meanwhile, have a great day, though. Thank you very much for being with us.